Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be reviewing the latest season of Big Brother Canada, BB Can 9, which really felt like a breath of fresh air for Big Brother here, where we've had a pretty big string of mediocre seasons. I mean, looking at BBUS, we had BB21, BB22. For BB Can, BB Can 7, BB Can 8 obviously weren't the greatest, so for us to finally end that string and get a good season here was pretty nice to see. Though I do feel like the reason why the season was so great was because of its cast and how terrible they were at the game. I do feel like this season was good despite of itself. I feel like production made so many questionable decisions with this season's format that just ended up working out for them because of how crazy these players were. I mean, twists like the team twist and the fake double eviction should have been massive knocks on this season, but because the gameplay never stopped and these players were just making really insane decisions, the season succeeded despite those. But obviously, like my other reviews, we will be running through the season week by week to give my more detailed thoughts. So let's start off with week 1. Which starts off with the team twist, which, I'll be honest, I kind of forgot this even happened. Like, this was such a pointless and mediocre twist as a whole, but I do think the fact that I forgot this happened is actually kind of a pro here. So here we did obviously have 2 teams of 7, having half the house safe each week as a team would be immune, and this really just minimized the possibilities for each week, and I felt like production realized that. And by week 2, they were just like, screw it, let's get rid of this thing. Which again, really did boon the season. I mean, getting rid of this twist really opened up the game to have more interesting dynamics. But I do think that, in general, this twist has probably just turned me off of the idea of teams moving forward in Big Brother. Like, I'm someone that, I always thought that having this team format, kind of like a Survivor-esque format for Big Brother could work. But I think after seeing the execution here, it's like it really just stifles the gameplay where half the people are safe and don't even really need to be playing that hard. And it really limits the amount of nominations. So I think at the end of the day, it's probably better to stay away from this twist moving forward. But as for the actual show itself, I mean, we do see that the captains are being chosen by the public. And this is when we get introduced to Kiefer and Tina. And I thought Kiefer was a shoo-in for this vote coming into the season. I was pretty surprised about Tina, though. I am still surprised that Julie did not get voted in here, where I did think she was a favorite due to the fact that she had a following before entering the show. I do think one positive of this twist is that it did give these 2 older figures coming into the season a leg up in terms of them getting to pick the teams, them being immune for the first week, which I think took away this aspect of, oh, we'll just get the old person out first. But then we do meet the other players, where right off the bat we see Jed and Ty create the Undercover Brothers Alliance, which was a pretty prominent duo during most of the season, and they do end up becoming the base for the Sunsetters Alliance that initially looked like they were going to run the game until we found out how bad every player from this season is. But then we get a pick for the teams, followed by a team safety comp, which Vic ends up winning for Team Destiny, which does lead to the entire team defender being nominated for eviction, with the exception of Kiefer. And we do get a Survivor-esque vote here, and I really just didn't love this. I mean, I don't like when BB Can has these really radical format changes for week 1. I mean, while I don't mind having no HOH for week 1, as it does allow for a more dynamic formation of the game's power structure where there isn't a central figure to really build the entire power structure around, I didn't like that, again, this many people were nominated and that every single person could vote here. It really just felt like a radical departure from what we would typically see on Big Brother. But then again, this is BB Can, and the way that they structure week 1 is really strange, where they try to go through an entire round of gameplay within 2 episodes, which is just a terrible idea, and I don't know why they do this. Obviously, BBUS, I mean, outside of the day 1 evictions that have been starting more recently, they typically allow that first round of the game to last 2 weeks. While here, it's they really just rush through it in 6 days, and because of that, there's obviously not enough airtime to fit the intro to the season plus an entire round of gameplay into just 2 episodes, which they tried to do back in earlier seasons of BB Can. And I get that they don't really want to do that, but I just don't get why they just don't add an extra week here. And through that, they can add another double eviction later down the road or something. Like, it just makes more sense to me to do it that way. And that way we also don't get screwed out of not seeing a certain player on the feeds or on the season as a whole. I mean, Julie would have been someone that would have been fun to see more of on this season. But again, they're pretty stuck in this format at this point where they've been doing this since the very beginning of the series. But we do get to the actual round itself where we do get a number of targets being thrown around from Jed to Ro, but it really feels like it lands on Josh for him not integrating well socially and also being looked at as a weakness for his team. Again, this is a more team-based game at this point, at least that's the perception. And we do see Josh playing really frantically here with him going to Julie and telling her about how he's worried about Pretty Boys 2.0. And Julie ends up spreading this around, which seems to put a massive target on her back, particularly from LaToya, who ends up orchestrating a flip here, which from what I understand was a last second flip. Like, this happened on the day of the eviction, which really felt like Toya just playing way too hard here for very little benefit. But we do get to the eviction where instead of speeches, we get the entire team being like asked questions secretly from like the members of Team Destiny, and this was just kind of awkward. It was bizarre to me. But we get to the votes where Julie and Victoria end up voting for Josh while everyone else votes for Julie. And I still can't believe Julie was the first boot on this season. I mean, she was someone that I said in my cast assessment I was expecting to make a deep run into the season. As a character on the season, I mean, she was fine. Obviously, she didn't get that much screen time considering she was only in 2 episodes and had to share those episodes with the setup for the season. But she did get some nice segments here, and particularly the one about her coming out. That was a good moment for her. I mean, you get some Alliance making content with her, making the dolls with Brayden and Austin. And she seemed to be playing pretty hard, but probably too hard for her own good. And while it is a shame to lose her so early, obviously it does start off the season with a bit of a bang. And now let's jump to week 2, which starts off with an endurance HOH, which Austin ends up winning, making all of Team Destiny safe again, meaning that we again have this really limited field of nominations here for Austin, especially considering that she's friends with Brayden. She made a deal with Jed and Toya, leaving her with only 3 people to choose from. And I think, again, this severely limits the possibilities for this week's gameplay, though we still end up getting a lot of intrigue. But again, none of that comes from Austin herself, where she plays really conservatively and really does nothing to set herself up for the future. She really just wastes the power of being the first HOH here, and that's the story of Austin throughout the entire season, with her just playing too passively throughout the game while also increasing her threat level despite not really being a threat. I mean, she makes the obvious move here in putting up Kiefer, someone who is rooting against her in the HOH, and also puts up Josh, the person who is clearly on the outs. And while her targeting Josh isn't a bad move, she has, again, nothing to set herself up moving forward and gains nothing from appeasing the house here. We do get formally introduced to the Sunsetters this week, where we see them coming together after realizing that the teams don't matter, which again is funny that the formation of this early majority alliance comes from the pointlessness of this twist. But once Kiefer wins the veto, Austin is essentially forced to put Ro on the block as he's the only one that she doesn't have some sort of deal with. And this is where the week gets a lot more interesting, as the Sunsetters have the power at this point to dictate the vote. And with Ro being this big threat on the other side of the house, most of Sunsetters do decide to flip the vote against Ro. However, Tina, who at this point is playing both sides, decides to not go along with the flip, causing a lot of back and forth throughout the week. And the Sunsetters really just ruin their own game here. I mean, particularly Toya, who continues to try to flip the vote up to the last second, despite it very clearly not going through at that point. And because of how flip-floppy the Sunsetters are this week and how terrible they just play this week, another side does end up getting put together here against them, which ends up creating a lot more intrigue moving forward. But this is when I started to realize, obviously, just how terrible the gameplay was going to be on this season, where no one could play optimally throughout the entire season. I mean, we do get a house meeting this week that was just ridiculous, where Jed just calls out Josh for lying about what Ro's been saying. And again, this was a pretty bad move, really, for everyone involved. But we eventually do get to the vote where Josh is voted out unanimously, and we get the announcement that the teams are done. So, I mean, that was pointless. But we do get a really great HOH comp after this, where it is the knockout comp, where almost everyone gets their questions wrong, and Victoria ends up winning despite rarely answering a question. But before moving on, let's talk about Josh, who I was really surprised he ended up being as great of a character as he was here. Before the season, I was thinking he was going to be kind of a dud, both from a character and a gameplay perspective, but here he ends up being entertaining in both. I mean, from a character standpoint, he was a really unique figure for the show, a type of character that I don't feel like we've really seen before. And again, as a player, he plays pretty hard. Again, not well, but he did everything he could to try to stay in the game. I really wasn't expecting him to actually be playing as hard as he was, and I was pretty sad to see him go by the end of the week here. Now for week 3, which was a really interesting week where Vic is the HOH, and we have the entire power structure just flip on the Sunsetters here with the formation of the Oddballs, which was essentially just everyone outside that group plus Tina. And it did feel like we were going to have these warring factions from this point forward, but again, this season doesn't end up working out like that due to the terrible gameplay and the fluidity of the season. We do see Kiefer trying to pin the potential flip on Vic, which does get back around to her, and again, it does end up exposing him, leading to a confrontation between him and Toya and Ro and Kyle. And this was a pretty fun fight, especially seeing Ro yelling at Toya, saying that he's the most calm, cool, collected person in this house. But this argument does really turn Kiefer against Ro and Kyle moving forward, to where he pretty much just has a vendetta against them until they're both out of the game. But we do learn that Vic is targeting Toya here, which portrays that it's because she constantly flip-flops, but I think as the season goes on, it's pretty clear that she did so that she can get closer to Ty and Jed. And Vic's HOH reign here is a complete mess, with her playing so hard but not really doing anything to benefit her actual positioning moving forward. And if it had not been for a lucky HOH result for next week, Vic would have been the next boot. I mean, she handles the veto this week pretty terribly, where after Jed wins the veto and thinks about using it on Toya, she strong-arms him by saying that she's going to put up Ty if he does so. And while theoretically this is the correct move, the way she does it, where she tries to gaslight him into thinking that it's all their faults for her having to put Ty on the block, it really turns them against her to the point where, she's the target coming into the next week for them. But as we near the vote, it is pretty clear that Toya is going home with the votes of the Oddballs, while Jed, Ty, and Beth are left on the outs, which again is somehow a blindside for the Sunsetter side, where even coming into the eviction day, Toya was talking as if she was staying, so I don't get how she believed that she was so safe here. But this was a really fun week, particularly watching Vic playing way too hard and seeing the Sunsetters face some adversity here. And this roller coaster of a season does continue when Kiefer, of all people, ends up winning the next HOH. Before we move on, let's talk about Toya, who I really loved on this season. I'm probably the most notable pre-jury boot here, and the person I would probably like to see back the most out of the pre-jury boots here. She was this unique figure of this person trying to play really hard, this person that made the majority alliance, successfully flipped the vote against Julie, and try to do it again against Ro. Again, this really super aggressive strategic player, but also one that had a strict moral code that doesn't seem to be willing to break that. I mean, when Tina turns against her, despite Tina being her best shot at staying, Toya just refuses to be fake with her in order to stay in the game. I mean, obviously a massive flaw gameplay-wise for her, but I do think that makes her a really complex figure on the season. Someone I wouldn't be opposed to seeing again in the future. But now for week 4, where we get a Kiefer HOH, and he does obviously go after Kyle and Ro, with their relationship being severed in the previous week. And I did find it humorous how they were really incredulous over this, that Kiefer isn't going to target the people that voted against him, when it's you didn't do any work to get him on your side. It's why are you that surprised that you're being targeted here? I mean, it's kind of funny that they just assumed that Kiefer was going to be on their side, which is just really poor gameplay on their end. We do also get this ridiculous plot for Vic to pin the Toya vote on Beth, which just completely falls on her face. I mean, we do also see the Oddballs turn their back on Vic, again, pretty much making her disposable to everyone in the game except for Kiefer. And she does get lucky that Kiefer was the one person that wasn't willing to let her go at this point in the game. Ro ends up winning his first veto here, and Kiefer ends up nominating Austin, which really pisses her off as she assumed they made a deal during the HOH to keep each other safe. But again, this pretty much felt like a nothing deal, and definitely something that just kind of stemmed from desperation in my eyes. And even if it didn't, it's just such a bad move on Austin's end to actually be believing this. But during this week, we do get some of the Austin-Kyle showmance content, conveniently right before one of them ends up going home. But this did lead to a couple of boring days on the feeds with neither of them really campaigning. But towards the end of the week, we did get some intrigue with Kyle trying to flip the vote and him seeming to having a possibility of getting the numbers on his side. I mean, he obviously had Ro, he had Tina and Tara, he had Vic. Despite them getting into a fight earlier in the week, like, he had 4 people wanting to keep him in the game. The problem is that it was never going to be enough without the Sunsetters on his side, or convincing Kiefer to go against the Sunsetters, which was probably never happening at this point. So it was a tough battle there anyway, but he did come relatively close to actually making it happen. And Kyle, I mean, he was clearly the most boring person on this cast. I think it's pretty clear why he was an alternate before the season. But with that said, I do think he's probably one of the better players on this season. I think he's probably one of the players that has the most potential if he were to return, which obviously isn't very likely, but he seems like a decent all-around player. I mean, to be honest, at the end of the day, it's not even that he's that good. It's more so that just everyone else is so bad, and I just feel like his flaws were not as major as almost everyone else's flaws within the game. Again, he was decent enough at all 3 facets of the game, and that alone makes him one of the better players here, but again, a nothing figure for the show. Now for week 5, which was the Invisible HOH week, and I did really like this twist, but I do feel like it played out in the worst possible way. Having Vic become the Invisible HOH took out any of the mystery from this week, as everyone could tell that the HOH was her, as she's just this terrible actress and couldn't keep a secret for the life of her. But it was really frustrating to me to see how the show would just prop up Vic as like a masterful player and that she's tricking everyone in the house and no one knows that she's the HOH, even though they show like multiple conversations on the show and like edit them in a way to make it seem like they don't know that Vic is the HOH, despite them blatantly talking about Vic being the HOH in those conversations. Like, it really sucks that BB can't just accurately portray the feeds. I mean, that's one of my biggest issues with BB Can production, is that they have this desire to create these storylines that simply aren't true. And I think through that, it's ruined previous seasons of the show, with a BB Can 6 being a major example of that. Like, the feeds to the show being such a radical departure. And while this season wasn't as radical of a departure as that, I do think the Vic edit as a whole is one of those major differences here. And to be honest, because of them trying to prop up Vic, I feel like we miss out on so much great Vic content here due to BB Can not being able to show her in a negative light. Like, it really feels like BB Can just in general doesn't want to show people negatively unless they're about to go home. Like, they're obsessed with like having this good image for most of their players, especially these people that are trying to prop up as these masterminds. And again, Vic plays this week hilariously bad. But again, if you were watching the show, you wouldn't even realize that. I mean, she ends up winning a slop pass, but doesn't end up using it, as she ends up putting herself on slop. And people realize that if she were to use the slop pass, that makes her really suspicious, as obviously she would have put herself on slop thinking that she can use the slop pass. So once she hears people talk about this, she's like, crap, I can't use the slop pass anymore. I guess I'm going to be on slop for a week. So that was dumb. She ends up targeting Austin here. But there was actually a point where she was considering putting herself on the block next to Austin, which is just completely asinine. Obviously, she doesn't end up doing it. She ends up putting Brayden against her instead. But even this move to even target Austin is a really dumb move, as it really feels like she's playing the game for Jed and Ty at this point, turning against her own numbers and targeting someone who's just simply not a threat. I mean, again, Austin was such a passive player that Vic targeting her here was a massive waste of her HOH, especially an invisible HOH. And then she also tries to pin the HOH on Ty, which ends up losing trust with Jed and Ty as well, but Ro ends up winning the veto here and was really never going to use it, but the show again portrays it as if he was really considering it, but again, he really wasn't. I mean, it's dumb to use the veto here for Ro. One, he doesn't know who the replacement nom is going to be, plus also by using the veto on one of Austin or Braden, you're essentially just dooming the other. Like, you're essentially just making the decision there, and that's just kind of a bad position to be in. And really, the gameplay of this week was pretty stagnant, as Austin was such a clear target here. Though there was actually a flip in the works, as usual with this house, where Tina, Tara, and Ro were willing to save Austin and just needed Beth to make a move here against the guys, but she doesn't end up doing it, as it was way too early for her to be losing trust with them. And all of that just to lose Braden, who is someone that was also still willing to work with her at this point. So we do lose Austin, who, again, is a really terrible player. She was just way too passive in the game while also increasing her threat level at the same time. I mean, she'd get lucked out by the Sunsetters sucking so bad that it gave her a semblance of a chance moving forward to be building this group, this oddball group that could have had her back, but even then she couldn't even keep Vic on her side. And that's really bad. As a character, I mean, she was there. She was likable to a degree, though I do think she came off as pretty self-righteous at points, talking about how Kiefer and Vic were bad people when they ended up putting her on the block. I mean, I just found that pretty off-putting, and really just overall, Austin ended up being a pretty big disappointment for me in pretty much every aspect. But now we're in the jury phase of the game, and that starts with week 6, where Beth wins HOH, and I was fully convinced at this point that the triangle here were going to dominate the rest of the game, where they were in such a prime position to win out, especially if they just remain loyal to each other, though we obviously see that doesn't work out. But this was a really hectic week where the plan would change left and right, with Beth originally wanting to go for Vic, but then being convinced to go for one of Ro or Tara instead, who do end up being her noms, and Tara ends up getting this really sympathetic edit from this point forward. And really just throughout a lot of the season, it was really strange to me how Tara was portrayed, where for a good chunk of the season, especially before she becomes this massive underdog, like, she was really hated by the live feed community. And it really felt like at this point in the season, like, she was pretty dead in the water in terms of jury chances. No one respected her. So it felt really weird that she was always getting content on the show, despite her not really being that important on the feeds, and also getting positive content in that. But we do end up seeing the backdoor plan go through here once Ro wins the veto, leading to Vic being blindsided to a degree. I mean, being put on the block, and I mean, she did pick up on the DR asking her questions about being nominated, so it's like it wasn't that big of a surprise, but she definitely plays it up to be. And despite nomming her here, Beth, Ty, and Jed continue to flip-flop on what to do here the entire week. Now, like, Vic leaving here does greatly benefit Beth moving forward, as Vic was someone that was pretty anti-Beth throughout the season, but for Ty and Jed, it really was pretty integral that she ends up staying here, where Vic is a number for them, someone that is never going to target them, at least not until the end game. And there was this point where it seemed like they convinced Beth to flip back, to save her, against her own best interest. And we did get this really great house meeting, possibly the best house meeting in recent history, of Vic arguing with all of her former allies, namely Ro and Tara, telling Tara she doesn't deserve to be there. And again, that was just a fun exchange. They also bring up the Oddball Alliance, and Vic is like incredulous, talking about how she would never come up with a name that stupid when she's the person that named it. So again, that was all fun. I mean, Vic does end up getting voted out here unanimously. But let's just talk about Vic, who, I mean, was the star of the show up to her boot here. I mean, she was a fantastic character. For me, an absolute lock for an all-star season. But she is such a terrible player. Again, she just plays way too hard without making genuine bonds with people within the game, to the point where, like, no one trusts her in the game. No one wants to keep her around in the game. I mean, everyone had a reason for her to go home here. I mean, even Kiefer let her go home after saving her during his HOH week. I mean, really, Vic just plays so terribly on this season. Again, it's so frustrating that BB Can latches on to these people that do play terribly and try to prop them up as, like, masterful players. Again, we saw that with someone like a Sarah Hanlon in BB Can 3. We see it. That was someone like an Allie from BB Can 6. They do this all the time, but despite that, I mean, she still is one of the most notable figures from the season. She still is a fantastic character. But after her boot, we do get a double eviction. And I'll say I was pretty hyped for this double eviction coming into it. It felt like anybody could go here except for Tina, depending on the circumstances. But we get the most boring outcome here, with Kiefer winning HOH, which meant that he was obviously targeting Ro. And then Ty wins the veto, so Ro goes home. Again, it was so boring. Well, again, we lose Ro, who I really liked on this season. I mean, he's definitely one of the more strategic thinkers on the cast. But like the rest of the cast, he's really had some flawed gameplay here, particularly with his bad reads and him just not knowing how to interact with people in a way that didn't come off as really robotic. Like, I do think he comes off as a really schemy guy because of that. Now, I was surprised at his physical ability in the game, with him winning 3 vetoes in a row, and him also getting into a few confrontations that were pretty fun, which made him really different from the Dr. Will-esque figure that I expected him to be coming into the season. But still, I think he's a fun character, and again, another one that I wouldn't be opposed to seeing again in the future. And now let's move on to week 7, where I think this is where the season just completely goes off the rails. I mean, before this, it was a crazy season with almost everyone playing suboptimally, but I think this is where it becomes clear that this is on historic levels. I mean, we get the start of the week with Jed winning HOH, which seemed to all but confirm the dominance of the triangle moving forward, especially considering the fact that Brayden decided to help them in this HOH comp. And through this, we do get a really fun moment with Tara calling out the trio and Brayden for just letting Jed win the game. And this does lead to Kiefer getting really upset, thinking she's calling him a coward. And like Kiefer talks about how he's never going to give them the chance to take him out of this game. He's winning this game. And this was all really great setup for his downfall this week that kind of happens. This is also around the time that Beth starts to get this really villainous edit as well, which led to them, again, really propping her up as this, like, mastermind for the trio, despite the fact that she, again, rarely gets what she wants in this game, and the other two being way more important to their success, but whatever. She is the one that really wants to get rid of Kiefer this week, and while that does later become the plan, it has nothing to do with her wanting this to be the plan. She actually ends up dropping this idea, and the plan later becomes backdooring Brayden. So, like, when Tara wins the veto, I remember, like, everyone was thinking, oh, this is going to end with Brayden on the block, and we see the Fiend's return, and it turns out Jed has now changed his mind, and he is targeting Kiefer as the biggest threat on the board, which again came out of left field. Now, whether or not this was the right move for Jed to be doing at this point is debatable, but he seems so resolute in doing this now, which is obviously a massive change of pace from him flip-flopping his decisions like every week before this, and he does end up putting Kiefer on the block, and we get this really emotional scene where they tell Kiefer, and that was really great, where we see him kind of fall from this cockiness that he was showing earlier in the week, and really Kiefer just ends up moping around for the next couple days, but eventually he does decide to finally try to stay over Tina, which I really thought was impossible. But then here we see how bad these players truly are. Where Kiefer campaigns to Jed, literally gives him like the most generic campaign he possibly could have given them. He literally is pretty much just saying like, hey, you know you could keep me, right? And Jed and Ty are like, you know what? Yeah, we'll keep you now. Again, it was that easy. I mean, it really was like, just give them an alternative option, they'll take it. I mean, that's really the players that we're working with on this season. And the fact that Tina ends up going home this week is so ridiculous to me, considering how safe she was every week before this and how she seemed to be like a lock for Final Four at this point. And the fact that they're getting rid of her in order to keep Kiefer in the game is ridiculous. And what's even more ridiculous is the fact that after Tina finds out that she's going home, she doesn't even try to stay. I mean, I do feel like if Tina had at least tried, she possibly could have flipped the vote here again. Again, like, it literally took nothing for Kiefer to flip Jed and Ty. Like, I'm pretty sure Tina could do the same thing, but nope, she ends up going home. And let's talk about Tina, who was a really interesting player this season. Again, like, for most of the season, I do feel like she was the best player on the season. I feel like she had one of the soundest strategic minds on the season. She was in the best position in the house for most of the season. The problem is that she plays way too passively in order to be maintaining that position. When she did put in work, she did play pretty well, and she was pretty integral in making the Vic backdoor happen. She was a calming presence for Tara. And until the Kiefer backdoor, again, she was locked for Final Four, where everyone wanted to take her to the end. But again, it's her passiveness in the game that really cost her by the end here. And also, as a character, she was just non-existent on the show. She seemed to be fine on the live feeds, but I just think that at the end of the day, she was just overshadowed by so many other better characters. And sadly, despite her playing a pretty good game for the first half of it, I do think she is probably going to be forgotten about later on in BB Can history. And now let's jump to week 8, which will, for me, go down as one of the best weeks in the history of Big Brother. I mean, this week was insane from almost every aspect. I mean, first up, we have Tara winning HOH, the first time in Oddball wins HOH and targets the triangle. We have Beth blowing up her own game in a position where she should have been safe and gets nominated alongside Jed. We have Jed win the veto, and it looks like Beth is going home, but then Kiefer creates this ridiculous plan to get Jed to use the veto on Beth and plans on blindsiding him immediately afterwards. Again, an insane move. And it actually works. I mean, Jed uses the veto on Beth, makes a deal with Tara to put Brayden on the block, essentially giving all of Jed's allies the votes here, essentially making him think that he is safe, while Tara thinks that Kiefer and Ty are on her side. And it's again another asinine move for Tara to be putting Brayden on the block here over Ty, as again, from a live feeder's perspective, we didn't even know where Ty was going here. We didn't know if he was still loyal to the triangle or if he was actually turning his back on Jed. But then we find out he is voting out Jed, and we get no real remorse from it. I mean, yes, the show portrays that he's like really struggling with this decision. They show him crying, but on the feeds, like, he seems so resolute on this decision. But he continues to lie to Jed about this, to the point where Beth is the one that has to break the news to him. And we really get this really emotional final few days for him being devastated that he made this really dumb move. And he does end up getting voted out unanimously, only for it to be a fake double eviction and him having a chance to return to the game. All of this is so insane. But also, what I haven't talked about is the fact that everyone plays so terribly on this week. It's like no one plays well here. Not a single person makes the correct decision for their game moving forward. Like, I've never seen a week like this in the history of Big Brother where everyone is playing so disastrously bad. And to illustrate that, let's literally run through each person on the cast. First up, we have Beth, who was literally safe coming into this week. Tara wanted to keep her safe no matter what, had no plans of getting rid of her, and then Beth just blows up her own game by creating this ridiculous scheme of trying to get Jed off the block by getting Ty and Brayden to volunteer being put up as pawns, which again ruins her relationships with both of them moving forward, and also ends with Tara putting her up on the block, where she does go home if Jed had used the veto on himself. We have Brayden, who literally says yes to going on the block when Ty is the swing vote between him and Jed, the person that was his best friend throughout the entire season. And this was so easily avoidable, where Tara literally gave him the choice of going on the block or not, and he said he's fine with going up. Again, ridiculously dumb move, as you never know what Ty was going to do here. We obviously have Jed, who won the veto and didn't use it on himself. Obviously a terrible move. We have Kiefer, who I think technically played the best here, in the sense that he did come up with the Jed plan and executes on it. He technically succeeds in what he was trying to do. The problem is that what he was trying to do was bad for his game. I mean, getting rid of Jed, it gets rid of a very blatant meat shield here that, again, Jed was also someone that was still willing to take him to the end under the right circumstances. Really, Kiefer 100% should have been targeting Beth here and should have been trying to get Ty out relatively soon afterwards to put himself into a position where Jed takes him to the end. Again, this massive meat shield that will be targeted over him, but also someone that will take him to the end and someone that Kiefer would beat at the end. And it was such a perfect position for Kiefer, but instead he just decides to throw that away because he thinks Jed is a big threat. Then we have Tara, who allowed Brayden to be on the block in a position where if he goes home, her game is essentially over, and I mean, probably over anyway, considering she does go home in the fake double eviction. But for her to open up this window here of Ty being the swing vote without gaining any social capital with Ty is, again, really terrible. And then we have Ty, who again gets rid of someone who was super loyal to him in Jed, where Jed was for sure taking him to the final three, where again, like, for sure he should have been getting rid of Beth. By getting rid of Beth, Jed ends up having Ty as his closest ally once again, and Ty has a really easy road to the end with more options moving forward. But instead he gets rid of Jed in a position where, again, he could have gone either way. Like, they didn't need to convince Jed to use the veto on Beth. They could have just had Jed use the veto on himself and then Beth go home, but instead he actively gets Jed out of the game. But he also does it in a way that completely burns Jed, and he continues to lie to Jed up until the point where even in his goodbye messages he's lying to Jed. And it felt very reminiscent to Paul from BB19 and how terrible of jury management this was. And Ty in general has just been really bad with his management of the jury. So again, no one plays well this week. Everyone plays terribly. But again, that's BB Can 9 for you. After the Jed eviction, we do get a fake double eviction, which isn't even a fake double eviction. I mean, it is in terms of BB Can standards, but it is a real double eviction. It's just that one person that is coming back from that double eviction immediately afterwards. It's really dumb branding, but Also, it's like, this is such a terrible time to have this fake double eviction. Again, it works out for him because of this Jed situation that ends up happening. But if that had not happened, like if this had been a standard season of Big Brother, this would have been such a terrible time to have a fake double eviction, where Tara had finally won HOH, this first person to win the HOH outside of the core power structure, and just to have Jed get the opportunity to come back into the game, again, is theoretically just terrible. But again, it ends up working out for him just because the entire side just ends up blowing up. As for the double eviction itself, we do see a lot of questionable strategic decisions here, where we do see Ty win HOH. He puts up Tara and Beth, stays loyal to his three of Brayden and Kiefer, and we really just rush through the veto where Brayden wins his first comp, which I might as well mention this here. I really didn't like the structuring of this episode. I mean, like, while this episode had a lot of great content within it, it really just felt rushed to the point where you could definitely tell they were just like blowing through certain things within the episode, specifically this veto competition, which like lasted like 30 seconds on the show. And here we have Brayden making a pretty bad move where he doesn't use the veto. Again, wasting this chance to make a move on Kiefer, the biggest jury threat, and also just not making a name for himself, where he's done nothing in the game up to this point and really needs to start making a name for himself. But then we get another really terrible decision, and Kiefer and Brayden deciding to vote out Tara over Beth. Again, Beth, who at this point is a jury threat. I mean, while they didn't perceive her that way, it did seem like the jury had a good amount of respect for Beth, especially over people like a Tara and a Brayden and even a Ty. And I think a lot of this comes from their own misconception of like Tara being the mastermind of the Jed boot and thinking that that'll bolster her jury chances, though it didn't really seem like they did that much. But we do get some fun reactions from the reveal that this was a fake double eviction, and it was cool to see Jed and Tara being snuck away into the HOH room. I mean, all this is really great, except for the fact that the feeds were shut down until the next episode. So we missed out on a lot of the aftermath of this on the feeds. And with that, let's jump to week 9. And I'll admit that with the absence of the live feeds for 4 days there, and just due to seeing less discussion about BBCan online, because I just started to lose interest. I mean, for me, by the time of the Monday episode, when the feeds returned, I just didn't care anymore. And that definitely was not helped by the fact that we probably get the most boring week of the season anyway here, where we get a pretty underwhelming outcome in my eyes, with Tara beating Jed to get back into the game. And I did feel like the editing was so heavy-handed here, where Tara was so clearly coming back, especially when like Jed would look distraught in the DRs. And I did feel like Jed returning here would have been such a great TV moment if it had happened, but it doesn't. But let's talk about Jed, who I thought was a pretty likable figure on this season. I mean, he just seemed to be a loyal, trusting guy. But through that, he obviously comes out of this game being betrayed in a pretty epic way. I mean, I do think Ty's betrayal of Jed here might be one of the most cold-blooded ones we've seen in the history of the show. I mean, to vote out a guy so loyal to his group that he would use the veto on the other nominee just for the chance of saving his entire group, and then for his own group to vote him out there. I mean, that's pretty brutal. And I do think Jed's downfall here was a really fun moment for a season. But again, I think it would have been even greater if he had returned into the game and we got to see him and Ty duke it out immediately afterwards. I mean, that would have been fun, but obviously it wasn't meant to be. But again, really, the rest of the week is just kind of boring here. I mean, Brayden does win the HOH in a tiebreaker against Beth, which was interesting to see. And he also ends up winning the veto as well, which again, a pretty impressive comp run here, but he does nothing with this power. Again, we just get a repeat of the fake double. He noms Beth and Tara, with now his preference being to get rid of Beth. Beth is the target, and I feel like this was all just a wasted opportunity. I mean, in the position that Brayden was in, I do feel like he needed to make a move to prove himself, and by him just doing the same noms as the fake double, it makes it look like he doesn't have a mind of his own and that he's just following Ty around. And it's also just not a good look to not be targeting Kiefer, this massive jury threat that he's now had the opportunity to get rid of so many times and just keeps on passing on it. Like, I do feel like Brayden just handles the power here pretty poorly. And through that, Beth is such a clear boot here for the majority of the week. Though we do see Beth putting up quite a fight, though I think she gets in her own way. I mean, I do feel like keeping Beth around was actually probably the better move for Ty and even Brayden, as I do think Tara was more likely to keep Kiefer around than Beth was, and the fact that Beth wasn't able to get that across is pretty bad on her end. And we do get some arguments between her and Ty moving forward that also just ruin her chances of staying. While Beth did go out with a bit of a splash here, I do feel like a good chunk of why she ends up going home was due to her own doing. But let's talk about Beth, who I know a lot of people are annoyed with, and I'll be honest, I was too. I mean, to me, she just comes off as fake for a lot of the season. The fact that she's overly excited during moments where you can clearly tell that she had other motivations. Like, it just came off as fake to me. But I also just don't think she played that good of a game. I mean, she would constantly hype herself up about how she was the mastermind of the trio and Jed and Ty wouldn't have the power that they had if it wasn't for her, but that's simply not true. I mean, Beth rarely got her way in most situations, and even when she did, the group would waver constantly, and she would just be willing to fold during most of those situations. And she just got lucky that it ended up flipping back to her side of things. I mean, the Vic vote is a major example of that. I mean, I do feel like Beth is just someone that portrays this fake confidence about her game in order to convince herself that she played a great game when in reality she just simply didn't. And now we're down to the final four, where we did get the BB Can Awards, which are always awkward, but this one in particular was really bizarre, with the players being dressed up in these really ridiculous outfits and them having to watch from the ball pit, and it was like hosted by the jury members over video, and it's like all of this was just so strange. But as for the game of this round, I mean, at this point it was pretty clear that both Ty and Brayden were taking each other to the end, as well with them showing us them talking about taking each other to the end in the DR, and really focusing around their relationship in these final few episodes, despite that relationship being completely ignored by the show beforehand. We do have Ty winning HOH here, and we do see a lot of this week from his perspective, with him wanting to get Kiefer out, and the episode's giving him and Brayden a lot of credit for influencing Tara's decision when Tara wins the veto, and I do think her keeping Kiefer here was the correct move. So in the final three with Ty and Brayden, like, she needs to win that final HOH to get to the end. Mind you, I think in that situation, if she gets to the end against either of them, she probably wins the game. However, one, I think Brayden was someone that was harder to beat in these endgame comps than Kiefer, and also Kiefer is someone that had a chance of taking her to the end. Again, she had no chance with Ty and Brayden. At least Kiefer would have considered taking her to the end. So I do think this was fully the wrong move for Tara here, where she decreased her possibilities of getting to the end, while also still being in a position where she needed to win that final HOH to win the game. But again, Ty and Brayden on the show get a lot of credit for convincing her to get rid of Kiefer by like lying to her about taking her to the end. But in reality, I think Kiefer's boot here lies entirely in his own hands. And to be honest, I think that's the thing about Kiefer, is I think so much of his downfalls within this season comes from his own actions. I mean, here Kiefer had so many opportunities to save himself, but he just constantly made himself a bigger target at every opportunity, where he wouldn't stop talking about how he's going to win at the end. He kept on telling Tara that, of course I'm going to take you to the final two because I'm going to beat you. Again, not the greatest argument there. He kept on talking about how Ty is going to take him to the end, which again is clearly not true, but he believed it. And through him telling Tara this, it just convinces Tara even more so that going to the end with Kiefer, where Ty will take Kiefer, that's a bad situation for her. Plus, also, he literally just tells her it's okay if she votes him out. Like, he really just did this to himself. And again, another example of on this season where people are just making the wrong decisions for their games and really just causing their own downfalls. But let's talk about Kiefer, who, I mean, as I mentioned, has massive holes in his game. I mean, his overconfidence being a major one here that led to others being well aware that he is a threat here. But despite that, I do think there is a serious debate for Kiefer being the best player on the season, which again just shows you how bad the players on the season are. I mean, Kiefer's social game left so much to be desired, but I do think strategically he is one of the better strategic thinkers on this cast. I mean, he was one of the more active players in the game, and while he would sometimes do moves that backfired on him, he does still pull off some pretty impressive maneuvers in this game. I mean, he stays in the middle of the house for a good chunk of the season. He's one of, if not the only HOH the entire season to effectively use the HOH power to strengthen his position in the game. I mean, he gets Vic to stay loyal to the Sunsetters, only the Blindsider immediately afterwards. He survives a back door. While again, I think that was very determined by this specific cast, it is still insane that he survives there. And he does orchestrate the Jed blindside. It's a really impressive list of achievements there, but he really just gets in his own way with his ego and poor social play that never makes it so that he fully lives up to his potential. But at the same time, again, like, he wins the game if he gets to the end. Easily. He easily wins the game. And, like, while his path there wasn't as secure as it could have been if he had just played slightly more optimally, that is also, again, a pretty impressive feat to get to the Final Four in a scenario where you completely blow out everybody in terms of jury votes. But also, we can talk about Kiefer as a character who, I mean, I know a lot of people hate Kiefer out there, but I mean, I really liked him. I mean, I think he's just such a fascinating character to me. I think he was a lot of fun to watch. Like, yes, he does get very cocky at points, but to me, that was just pretty humorous to see. To see his ego balloon for, like, almost no real reason. Like, he's just a man of extremes where he would go from being super pumped up, super hyped, talking about how he's one of the best players ever, to then just being down on the dumps and talking about how people should be voting him out. Like, just those two radical extremes was a lot of fun to watch. Plus, also, I liked him as a figure on this season as, like, this person representing his background. And I did feel like, at least on the show, he is very much portrayed as this inspirational figure. And I do think he has a pretty heartbreaking departure from the game here, where in his interview with Arissa, he's, like, crying, and even Arissa's crying as he does the exit interview. And that's a really great moment as well. Like, I do think Kiefer just played such a major impact on this season. And, like, while I get that there are some people out there that just don't like Kiefer, I personally did. And I did find him to be one of the best characters and players, I guess, on this season. Now let's move on to the finale, which was a really great finale. I mean, I do feel like BB Ken finales tend to drag with there being a somewhat obvious result by the time of the final two, but here I never knew who was going to win pretty much the entire time. I mean, we get the first parts of the HOH where Brayden wins part one, Ty wins part two, and at that point, I mean, it was pretty clear that Tara was going home, but I was still interested in who was going to win that final part of the HOH, as I do think that could have been the decision maker here. I mean, we do get Ty winning and voting out Tara, and from what we've heard of the jury right before the finale, it did seem like this jury decision might come down to, again, who was going to win this final HOH. Now, again, I personally don't think it should matter. I think it's really dumb to be voting based off of who wins this final comp. But still, I feel like it did add to the intrigue coming into the jury vote. But before moving on, let's talk about Tara, who did grow on me a bit as the season went on. I mean, I did feel like she started off as pretty unlikable and really came off as the second coming of Christmas, not the holiday, obviously, the player. But I do think once she lost Tina, she did become a pretty rootable underdog. Despite that, though, I never wanted her to actually win here, as I do think she still played pretty mediocrely, and with the fact that she also got voted out, had to come back in, I just don't think she played that good of a game, despite the fact that she was probably going to win against either Ty or Brayden. But I was really happy with a Ty and Brayden final two, again, the first all-black final two, in a mainline season of North American Big Brother, but also just felt right for the story of this season. But I will also say I was pretty scared that Brayden was going to win here. I mean, despite this being my ideal final two, at this point, I did feel like we needed a Ty win to have a satisfying conclusion to the season. I feel like his more cutthroat and active gameplay was something that should have been rewarded over Brayden's extremely passive to almost non-existent gameplay. And I got even more worried when we got to the jury questioning, where I thought Brayden really killed it there. I mean, while I don't agree with everything he said, he did sell it pretty well. Well, I felt like Ty just completely bombed a lot of his questions, still preaching on how he played with loyalty and only turned on the trio because they turned on him first. Again, like, just not a good look. But I did think he had a pretty great final speech, so really I came out of this not knowing who was going to win here. I mean, we did see Kiefer whispering Tayshaun to Vic, and to be honest, if it wasn't for that, I would have been fully convinced that Brayden was winning the game here. But we do still get a decently long reunion that I can do without, but it didn't feel like it dragged as much as it did previous seasons. I would prefer this to be after the winner reveal, again, kind of like how Survivor does it, but Big Brother just in general has never really done that for whatever reason. And we get to the vote reveal, where I was pretty mind blown to see all of the first four votes come up as Ty, and Ty wins the game in a 6-1 vote, only not getting Tara's vote. And this was such a great conclusion for the season to me from a story standpoint and also from a gameplay standpoint, where to me, with the exception of maybe Kiefer, I do feel like Ty represented this season the best, and his win does boost my overall opinion on the season. Now we also get a Canada's favorite house guest vote for first time ever, and we do see Kiefer win that, and that was a really great moment as well. Again, like the fact that he gets like initially pumped up because he obviously won the vote, but then realizes he also wins $10,000 and gets pumped up again immediately after that. That was just really funny. But again, I feel like it was really deserved. I feel like he really represents what this season was about, and I did love seeing him being rewarded for that. But now let's talk about the final two, starting off with the runner-up in Braden, who I like. I mean, he is a likable person and character on the season, but as a player, I just don't feel like he did much. I mean, during the jury phase of the game, he spent all of his time with Austin and didn't build as many social bonds as he could have. While he is likable, I do think this sentiment of him playing this great social game is completely misguided. Along with, I think, a lot of people's conceptions of what the social game is. Again, the social game is not simply being likable. The social game is using your likability and your social bonds in order to maneuver through the game, and Braden really does nothing with his social ability to actually better his odds of making it through the game. Despite him being relatively well liked and being good at bonding with people when he does have those conversations, which he rarely did, he never uses those to his benefit. And there were definitely points where he could have gone home had things gone the way that he even wanted them to go. I mean, back in the Austin week, he was campaigning for Roe to use the veto on Austin. If that had been the case, he goes home. He volunteers to go in the block during the Jed week, where he could have possibly went home. Again, like, to me, Braden was such a passive player that his game was almost non-existent. And because I do feel like it would have been a massive letdown if he did end up winning this season. But now let's move on to the winner in Ty, who, I mean, despite his flaws, which they are certainly there, I do think he still played probably the best overall game on the season, especially in this endgame stretch where, again, despite some wonky strategy here and there and just some abhorrent jury management at points, particularly with Jed and Beth, the way he maneuvered through those final few rounds was pretty impressive. I mean, he is one of the few players in the history of North American Big Brother to go through an entire season without being nominated. Now, I do think that stat is a bit overrated, as Ty got really lucky throughout the game for not being nominated, especially in that mid-game section where if any of the oddballs had ever won an HOH there, he was going on the block against Jed. Even during the Jed boot week, he first got lucky that Beth blew up her game that got her on the block over Ty, and then you follow that up with Braden just being okay with going up and volunteering to put himself up, essentially. If it hadn't been for either of those things, Ty does get nominated there. So again, his game is not perfect, but out of this cast of pretty bad players, Ty does come out of it showing the most overall ability, and his cutthroat nature in the endgame here was something that I was really happy to see get rewarded. But that's the season, and I mean, BBCan 9 here was something special. I mean, I do think this season will go down as one of the all-time great Big Brother seasons for me personally. I mean, especially BBCan. I mean, for me, it's a struggle between this and BBCan 5. I will say that as of right now, I would still say that BBCan 5 is above this, but this season was still incredible the entire way through, largely because of its cast and how hard they played, and also how terribly they played. But I do feel like they were also benefited from having more balanced competitions that really led to some unpredictable comp results that boomed this season. I mean, really, in many ways, this season reminded me of older school Big Brother, where I feel like so much of the modern landscape of Big Brother is usually dominated by one, maybe two players a season that are so far ahead of everyone else. And then competitions have played such a major impact on creating the power structures in the game. Well, that wasn't the case here. I mean, like, with this season, it was so turbulent the entire way through. The season never dragged for me. I mean, really, I wanted it to be longer. It felt like the season really just blew by. Like, it's been a while since we've had a season this consistent. Again, for BBCan, it's been since BBCan 5 for the US. I mean, dare I say it? I mean, this season's not too far away from, like, the BB10s, BB14s, BB7s of the world. I mean, I do think this is a top-tier season of Big Brother, which was really nice to see after a string of mediocre seasons in recent history. But that is my review for BBCan 9. Now, as I've done for recent Survivor and Big Brother seasons, I will be doing a player ranking moving forward. Now, that won't be the next video, comes out because there is the Circle Season 2 review, but I do hope to get that out pretty soon afterwards. As I said, I do have the Circle review coming. That Challenge All-Stars and Big Brother Australia are currently airing as well, and I'll cover those when they are done. Survivor South Africa starts next month, and that should be fun to cover. BB23 is not too far from now, and obviously I will cover that as well. Now, I did mention this in my Survivor South Africa cast assessment, but I feel like I might as well mention it here as well. But I have started streaming on Twitch here and there, at twitch.tv/TheMoranianReview, where I will just be playing games and rambling on about my thoughts on everything I care enough to talk about. So again, from reality TV to video games to random shows, movies, really just anything. I can talk about anything. So if you want to follow me there, that'll be cool. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.